Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116, and this is for our class for Monday, the 9th, where we are closing in on the ending of the semester. So we are finishing up with poetry. You'll notice the note in the notes below that I mistakenly discussed two additional poems that were not included in your syllabus, To His Coy Mistress and The Author to Her Book. So you can think of those as bonus poems. Certainly, you can read them on your own, and if it turns out that you wanted to write about them on the final exam, you certainly can. And in terms of the final examination, that will be this upcoming Monday on the 16th. What I'll do is I'll post the final at the time in which we would normally meet if we were in a face-to-face class. So that's at 10 a.m. And you would have 24 hours in which to respond to that final and return it to me via PDF. If we were taking this in a face-to-face situation, you would have approximately 2 hours. So that's about as long as I would think that you should be spending on the final, but I'll give you 24 hours. And it's open book, open notes. And you know that I like to ask questions. I don't necessarily have right or wrong answers because I'm interested in your thinking and reasoning. And all of the poems that we've talked about in the poetry section will be possibilities, including those two poems that I mistakenly discussed because I assigned them in another class and I ended up discussing them with us. But both are excellent poems. To His Coy Mistress, an example of metaphysical poetry, and The Author to Her Book, an example of an extended metaphor, and also a female author writing in a time period where you don't necessarily expect female authors to be writing. And that said, we have some upcoming poetry as well. And I had talked about William Blake, who wrote his poem in the 1700s, as opposed to the poetry that we began with, which was in the 1600s. And I'm a fan of the 1600s. I'm not the biggest fan in the 1700s, but you know that Dead Poets Society focused a lot on the poets known as the Romantic poets that were writing during the 1700s. And when we say romantic, we're talking about how they would oftentimes write about nature and how nature could reflect the human world, or perhaps the other way around, that the human world reflects the natural world. But nevertheless, what we end up seeing in this poem, The Sick Rose by William Blake, is a short but I think very typical kind of romantic poet. And I know that at this point in the semester, you've probably come to the conclusion that a poem or any piece of literature can't necessarily mean what it literally says. And yes, it can. But what we've been striving for is seeing how it can also mean something else. And I love The Sick Rose because it can be read literally, because the romantic poets would have been writing about the natural world and talking about, oh, Rose, thou art sick, the invisible worm that flies in the night, in the howling storm. I mean, that could just be a pest. If you are a gardener, then you're well aware about the difficulty of raising roses. And if you think about the life cycle and the food chain, one life subsists on another. So an insect would eat the rose, in effect. And when he talks about your crimson bed, I mean, that could easily be a rose bed, and crimson red could be the color of the roses. And that said, we could also read it symbolically. So, Rose could be a woman who perhaps has lost her virginity, or it could be a woman involved in some sort of illicit affair. Oh, Rose, thou art sick, sick because now this woman has lost her reputation. And the invisible worm that flies in the night, the worm being a phallic symbol for a male, nighttime, oftentimes the time of intercourse. In the howling storm, again, one could think of sexual union as a howling storm, and has found out thy bed of crimson joy. Crimson could actually be a reference to blood, perhaps an exchange of blood or a loss of blood that could have occurred during sexual intercourse, especially if this was the loss of virginity. But that said, we could also think of Rose as representing perhaps society, and that this is about the corruption of society and the societal ills that it can destroy a life. Does thy dark secret love does thy life destroy. So, in terms of the sick rose, I would talk about all of those possible meanings, but don't negate the literal meaning of O rose, thou art sick. Because it would have been very typical, again, of the Romantics to have been talking about the natural world and natural processes. Now, for the 1800s, it wasn't too difficult to decide which author to assign, particularly in our location, and that would be Emily Dickinson, because she is from Amherst, and she's very well known, went to Mount Holyoke College, and because I Could Not Stop for Death is a great example of her poetry. She oftentimes writes about death, but not necessarily in a negative way. She'll oftentimes write about death from the perspective of the dead. And while she wasn't necessarily religious, in fact, she refused to go to church after a certain point in time in her life, which would have been very noticeable for someone of her social station. She was the daughter of a prominent lawyer in Amherst. And that said, she was, however, quite spiritual, and she believed that one could witness the works of God through nature and the natural world. One didn't need to go to a church or a synagogue or any other human constructed place of worship. So, what you will oftentimes see in her poetry is that it's very personal. She's talking about herself, but it's also universal. And I think that's one of the reasons why Emily Dickinson resonates with so many people. And I'm the first to admit that I didn't particularly care for Emily Dickinson when I was an undergraduate, mostly because I didn't understand her poetry. And once I learned that even the critics and the scholars struggle to understand her poetry because so much of it is so personal, I felt a lot better about it. And not necessarily needing to understand a poem in its entirety, just a word or a phrase. So, one that oftentimes is given during graduations, certainly that's been the case at GCC, is I dwell in possibility. And think about all of the possible meanings of that phrase, about how appropriate it is for someone who's graduating, because they basically are living or dwelling in the idea of hope or possibility, which is why they've embarked on an educational journey and now have reached the conclusion through graduation. But also dwell as in obsessing or focusing over. One of my favorite Emily Dickinson quotes is, "One need not be a chamber to be haunted." One need not be a chamber to be haunted. You don't need to be a physical structure. You can be haunted by your own demons and your own personal ghosts. And one of the things that Emily Dickinson does is that she uses dashes in the places that you would expect to find commas. In fact, that's the way that you know that you are reading the correct Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson wrote over 1,000 poems, and she wrote them mostly for herself. She bundled them up and kept them in drawers. Upon her death, her sister and a family friend published some, and they actually went through the poetry and corrected it, which is a huge sin. You can't do that with poetry. Poetry is supposed to break grammatical conventions, but they ended up standardizing the capitalization, because she'll oftentimes capitalize words that we wouldn't normally capitalize. And they took out those dashes at the ending of many of her lines, substituted them with commas. Now, a dash is a much longer pause than a comma, so it gives much more weight to what follows afterwards. It also helps to mimic the structure of church hymnals. This was one of the ways that Emily Dickinson really broke with convention, is that she was using the structure of many church hymnals. But with the church hymnal, you know that you need to take a long pause at the ending of each line so that you can draw a breath for the next line, hence the dash. So this is somebody who is using the structure of a church hymnal to talk about life, not from a religious perspective, or at least an organized religious perspective, which is again how she broke conventions. The way she lived her life also broke conventions. She didn't marry and give dinner parties, which is what was expected of somebody of her social class. She remained single, living in her father's house, and became, the word we would use nowadays is agoraphobic, afraid to go outside. And she would just basically stay in her room and write poem after poem after poem. So I talk a little bit more about Emily Dickinson in my Women in Literature class, but she's a fascinating person. And luckily for us, we can visit her homestead. And in the second section, the notes below, you can see that I've included a link for the Emily Dickinson Museum. And I encourage you to visit. But in terms of thinking about Because I Could Not Stop for Death, it's one of the poems that perhaps is easier to understand. One of the reasons why I had assigned it, and one of the reasons why it's oftentimes anthologized. And you can see that it's in multiple stanzas, and we had talked about how stanzas are basically much like paragraph divisions. And it reads, Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor, my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove, at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The Jews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. And you can see that the rhymes aren't always exact. And she capitalizes some words such as death at the beginning, and that helps to personify the idea of death. There's a long literary tradition of death being a he, the Grim Reaper. And she talks about herself that she couldn't stop for death because we don't decide when we die. Death decides when he's going to take us. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. We don't usually think of death in terms of being kind, but the way death is presented in this poem, death is kind and also civil. The carriage held but just ourselves. There's a long literary tradition of life as a journey and that you're in a carriage. And keep in mind there wouldn't have been cars at that point. There would have been horses and carriages. That's basically drawing you along the journey of life. And immortality. And the reason why this isn't a negative poem is because death is bringing immortal life. And the poem talks about all of the negatives that can be associated with mortal life. Because death drove slowly, he knew no haste. The idea of being late, the idea of having time constraints, that's an earthly constraint. That's not something that's found in the afterlife or in the spiritual world. I had put away my labor, my leisure too. So labor is part of the earthly world, and so is leisure. And we only need leisure because we have labor. Again, all of those would be irrelevant in the spiritual world. And here we're told that death is civil. Previously, we were told death was kind. And then all of the things that they pass, they're leaving the worldly behind. We pass the school where children strove at recess in the ring. So this is supposed to represent early life when we're children. And at recess, the idea of play. In the ring, I don't know if you've ever heard of the old children's Ring Around the Rosie, Pocket Full of Posy, which actually happens to be a little chant about plague. So it's rather negative. We pass the fields of gazing grain, and that represents adulthood when you would be basically working on the farms, the gazing grain. And we pass the setting sun, and that represents the ending of life, old age. Or rather, he passed us. The sun is passing them. Basically, they're moving away from the earthly realm and moving into the spiritual. The dews drew quivering and chill. So now, since they've passed the sun, things are getting colder. But that also is an earthly construct. Temperature. It's something you don't need to worry about in the afterlife. So even though her gown was only made of gossamer, which is a very thin, insubstantial fabric, oftentimes associated with fairies, my tippet, which is a shawl, only tulle. Again, that's another thin fabric. You make things like tutus and wedding veils out of them. We passed before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. And house is capitalized, so we can speculate as to what that house might mean. Perhaps it's the house of God. Perhaps it's a church. Perhaps it's her crypt, the house that she's going to be buried in. Perhaps it's literally her home. There is a tradition that funerals will oftentimes drive by the home of the deceased, the funeral procession. But we paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. This house is so far away, it just looks like it's a little swelling in the ground. In other words, they're that far away from the earthly world. The roof was scarcely visible. You could barely see the roof. And the cornice, which is an architectural detail in the roof, in the ground. So that's how tiny it seemed, like a little speck. And then the most important stanza, the last one. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet. So this happened centuries ago. In other words, Dickinson is talking about, or the narrator, we assume it's Dickinson, is talking about the afterlife from the perception of being in the afterlife, which is proof that the afterlife exists. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day. Because again, time is an earthly construct. I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. And horses' heads would be literal because the horses are pulling the carriage. But horses' heads, that's also a biblical reference to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. In other words, the ending of the world and what we will all face at the ending of the world. So that gives you a little bit of a taste of some of Emily Dickinson's writing. And I wanted to leave you today with an incredibly famous poem that you've probably heard of before, Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken. And in fact, you might be noticing in the notes below that I am including online links. And I can say that the link that I included for Because I Could Not Stop for Death, you'll see a little arrow if you were to click on that link, and you can hear an audio of that poem being read, in this instance by a professional reader. The Road Not Taken, you'll see that I've given you 2 links, one to find the text of the poem, but the other is a YouTube link where you could actually hear Robert Frost himself read that poem. So I encourage you to do that so that you can listen to the author himself. You can tell from his gravelly voice that he's older when he was reading this particular poem. And not only is this an incredibly famous poem, just like Shakespeare's sonnet, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, but it also is incredibly misread. So, I think about Emily Dickinson and the ways that she might be similar to Shakespeare in the sense that she didn't title any of her poems, much like Shakespeare didn't title any of his sonnets. So you refer to Emily Dickinson's poems by the first line, much like you do with Shakespeare's sonnets. But perhaps The Road Not Taken is even more similar to the sonnets because, as we know, that sonnet, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, is usually misunderstood. And we talked a little bit about how it's usually thought of as a male poet writing to a female and expressing his love and admiration and sexual desire. Though there's no reference in there to anything sexual, and there definitely is no reference in that poem to any kind of gender. And if poets are correct, and or scholars are correct, and this is part of the early set of sonnets, then this sonnet, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, was written to Shakespeare's patron, perhaps the Earl of Southampton, and it's more a sonnet of flattery than anything else. And The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost is usually thought of as a celebration of being unique and independent. In fact, that's what was alluded to in Dead Poets Society, which we saw. But look at the title. The title says everything. This poem is not about the choice made, it's about the choice not made. So The Road Not Taken. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other, as just as fair, then having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, how I kept the first for another day. Yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. That has made all the difference. But if you were to go through these sonnets, two roads diverging in a yellow wood, and we're talking about the wood, something that's wild and untamed. We talked about this with Young, Good, and Brown. Yellow, I can't help but think of New England and the leaves changing, and this is a poem about change. And so I could not travel both. In other words, you can't have everything. One choice precludes another. And this traveler is looking down into the undergrowth and thinking that perhaps one road is better. And then he realizes in the second paragraph that both are just as fair, it seems. That perhaps, in other words, maybe one has a better claim because it seems to have been less worn down than the other path. Though that morning, it seems, they were really about the same, and that's the key at that particular moment. So if you've ever had a difficult decision in your life and you vacillate back and forth, and where at one particular point it seems that both options are equal, that's really what's happening with this poet. And thinking about, well, perhaps I'll take one road, make one choice, and then go back and find the other. But we know how difficult it is to go back because one choice is going to change everything. So it'll be impossible to go back and have those two choices in the way they initially presented themselves. And then the last stanza, that I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. I'll be talking about this sighing in the future. And think, you can sigh with happiness and contentment. You could sigh with sadness or despair. We're not quite sure which. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I. Notice the repetition of I. This is a personal choice. Took the road less traveled by, and that's made all the difference. But we don't know if that's a positive or a negative difference, especially because of the title, The Road Not Taken. The regret, or at least curiosity about what would have happened with the choice that you did not take. But more than anything else, I wanted to give you an example of how to explicate this poem, which in the text that I had ordered for you is on page 874, but I'll read you the explication. Remember, we had talked about explication, which sounds like the word explain, to go through a poem very carefully and word by word, piece of punctuation by piece of punctuation. And this could give you an example of how you could write about a poem. Now, I certainly don't expect something as well written or detailed or developed for the final exam. You just obviously wouldn't have the time. Though I do expect for the final you'll have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But outside of that, just to give you an idea of how you could write about poetry, The Road Not Taken intrigues readers because at once it's so simple, so deeply resonant. Recalling a walk in the woods, the speaker describes how he came to a fork in the road, which forced him to choose one path over another. Though sorry he could not travel both, he made a choice after carefully weighing his two options. This essentially is what happens in the poem. There's no other action. However, the incident is charged with symbolic significance by the speaker's reflections on the necessity and consequences of his decision. So that's the first paragraph. So we get the name of the poem. I would add also the name of the author, and we get a thesis. And this is multiple sentences long. The next paragraph, which is a body paragraph, the final stanza indicates that the choice concerns more than simply walking down a road. For the speaker says that choosing the less traveled path has affected his entire life. That has made all the difference. Frost draws on a familiar enough metaphor when he compares life to a journey, but he's also calling attention to a less commonly noted problem. Despite our expectations, aspirations, appetites, hopes, and desires, we can't have it all. Making one choice precludes another. It is impossible to determine what particular decision the speaker refers to. Perhaps he had to choose a college, a career, or a spouse. Perhaps he was confronted with mutually exclusive ideas, beliefs, or values. There's no way to know, because Frost wisely creates a symbolic choice and implicitly invites us to supply our own circumstances. So that's the second paragraph. And notice that this author decided to talk about the last stanza of the poem. So you can start from the end and work your way up. You don't have to talk about a poem chronologically. So the next body paragraph reads, the speaker's reflections about his choice are essential to an understanding of the poem as the choice itself. Indeed, they may be more central. He describes the road taken as, quote, having perhaps the better claim, / because it was grassy and wanted wear, unquote. He prefers a less traveled path. This seems to be an expression of individualism, which would account for the difference his choices made in his life. But Frost complicates matters by having the speaker also acknowledge there is no significant difference between the two roads. One was just as fair as the other. Each was, quote, worn really about the same. Both that morning equally lay / in leaves no step had trodden black, unquote. So notice that in this body paragraph, we've got quotations to support what it is that we're saying, much like you would quote from a drama or from a short story. And ultimately, when I was reading the quotes and I said / that means a line break. That's how you indicate that you're quoting more than one line of poetry. The / would show where one line would end, and then after the / where the new line would begin. And then the next body paragraph. The speaker imagines that in the future, ages and ages hence, he'll recount his choice with a sigh that will satisfactorily explain the course of his life. But Frost seems to be having a little fun here by showing us how the speaker will embellish his past decision to make it appear more dramatic. What we hear is someone trying to convince himself that the choice he made significantly changed his life. When he recalls what happened in the yellow wood, a color that gives a glow to the irretrievable moment when his life seemed to be on the verge of a momentous change, he appears more concerned with the path he did not choose than with the one he took. Frost surely titles the poem to suggest the speaker's sense of loss and not being able to travel both roads. When the speaker's reflections about his choice are examined, the poem reveals his nostalgia instead of affirming his decision to travel a self-reliant path in life. So at the ending of that paragraph, you can see that they try to give an explanation what yellow meant. I had talked about my own explanations that I always think about the autumn and the fall. In this instance, this author is talking about how yellow gives a color that gives a glow to that irretrievable moment when life seems to be on the verge of a momentous change, which is somewhat similar to the idea of autumn representing change. I personally like my definition a little bit better. But as long as it seems possible, that's all that matters. As long as you have evidence in the text to support your argument, you can all come up with different arguments, and they would all be equally valid if you had evidence to support it. Much like a courtroom attorney, and you're putting together pieces of evidence to present. So now the next body paragraph. The rhymed stanzas of the road not taken follow a pattern established in the first 5 lines. A-B, A-A-B. This rhyme scheme reflects, perhaps, the speaker's efforts to shape his life into a pleasing and coherent form. The natural speech rhythms Frost uses allow him to integrate the rhymes unobtrusively. But there's a slight shift in lines 19 and 20, when the speaker asserts self-consciously that the less traveled road, which we already know to be basically the same as the other road, made all the difference. Unlike all the other rhymes in the poem, difference does not rhyme precisely with hence. The emphasis that must be placed on the difference to make it rhyme precisely with hence may suggest that the speaker is trying just a little too hard to pattern his life on his earlier choice in the woods. And we talked about scanning a poem, about identifying a pattern for either rhyme or meter. But if you are going to do that and talk about it, then you need to talk about how it's important to the poem itself, which this author did, talking about the rhyme scheme and that it reflects, perhaps, in other words, they're qualifying their argument, which is good, the speaker's efforts to shape his life into a pleasing and coherent form. Because this isn't necessarily an obvious argument, but it does seem to be possible. And he even says that, or the speaker, they even say that we have to emphasize the word difference to make it rhyme precisely with hence, which may suggest, so notice more qualification here, that the speaker is trying a little too hard to pattern his life and his earlier choice in the woods. So now we get to a concluding paragraph. Perhaps the best way to begin reading Frost's poetry is to accept the invitation he placed at the beginning of many volumes of his poems. The pasture means what it says, of course. It's about taking care of some farm chores. But it's also a means of saying one thing in terms of another. A nice way to conclude, though personally I wish there had been 3 sentences in that concluding paragraph rather than 2, because we know a paragraph is 3 or more sentences. But what a great example of an explication. Again, I'm not expecting anything as detailed or as developed, but I am hoping that you can have a beginning, a middle, and an end and begin to talk about the poetry, because we've talked about it all semester long, so you can begin to synthesize some of the ideas that we have discussed. So next class, believe it or not, is our last class before the final examination. So in section 4 and the notes below, you can see we'll be reading and discussing the poem America. I've provided you with the link for that. Coca-Cola and Coco Frio, I've provided you with the link for that. And finally, The Hill We Climb, and I provided you with the link for that. Next class is also when paper number 2 is due, so that would be on the 11th. So our very last class is Monday, a week from today, if you're watching this on Monday, on the 16th. This is when the final examination will be posted at 10 a.m. and it'll be due 24 hours later at 10 a.m. It is also the very last date you can hand in paper number 2. So on the 16th, it's over, so to speak. So what's left is our class discussion forum question, which will be due this Wednesday on the 11th. And you can see that I'm catching up now with your poetry discussion forum questions, but I wanted to do the drama ones first because that might have been useful for you for writing your paper. Out of all of the poems we've discussed so far in class, which did you like best and why? So I'll be curious to see which poem you select, and of course, more importantly, why you selected that poem. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class, which is our last class before the final examination, putting some closure onto poetry. Take care. Bye-bye.